September 23rd, 1916, 3:47 in the morning, Bucharest, Romania. The telegraph operator's hands trembled as he decoded the final words of the encrypted message from Berlin. Outside, the first pale light of dawn touched the spires of the Orthodox cathedral, casting long shadows across the empty boulevard where, in less than 72 hours, German and Austro-Hungarian troops would march in triumph. The operator set down his pencil and stared at the paper before him. Romania had entered the war on the side of the Entente exactly 1 month earlier. Now, King Ferdinand's gamble lay in ruins. The promise of Transylvania, dangled like a golden apple by French diplomats in elegant Parisian salons, had dissolved into ash and blood. The operator rose slowly, knowing he would have to wake the minister, knowing the minister would have to wake the king, knowing that everything they had believed about neutrality, about timing, about the calculations that governed nations, had been catastrophically wrong. What he could not know, as he walked through those silent pre-dawn corridors, was that Romania's collapse would reverberate across every remaining neutral capital in Europe, transforming the very mathematics of survival and forcing Greece, Bulgaria, and every wavering nation to confront a terrible truth. In total war, there was no such thing as perfect timing, only degrees of catastrophe. The story of neutral nations in the First World War is often told as a footnote, a sidebar to the great clashes at Verdun and the Somme, the U-boat campaigns and the Eastern Front's endless retreats. But to understand the war's true nature, one must understand the excruciating calculus faced by nations like Romania and Greece, caught between empires, pressed by contradictory promises, their leaders tormented by impossible choices. These were not minor players avoiding responsibility. They were chess pieces that became players, observers who became victims. Nations that discovered neutrality itself was an illusion, maintained only by the temporary exhaustion of greater powers. Their stories reveal something fundamental about the Great War. It was not merely a conflict of armies, but a systematic dismantling of the old diplomatic order, a furnace that consumed not just soldiers, but the very concept of sovereignty for smaller states. Act 1. The Illusion of Choice. To understand how Romania and Greece arrived at their respective precipices, one must return to the summer of 1914, when the assassination at Sarajevo seemed, to most European statesmen, like yet another Balkan crisis in a region famous for crises. In Bucharest, King Carol I, a Hohenzollern by birth and German by sympathy, believed firmly that Romania's future lay with the Central Powers. He had signed a secret treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1883, renewed periodically, committing Romania to their side in any European war. But Carol was 75 years old, his health failing, and he had gravely miscalculated the mood of his own country. When he convened a Crown Council on August 3, 1914, expecting to honour the secret treaty and join Germany, he encountered a wall of opposition so complete it would hasten his death. Prime Minister Ion Brătianu, reading the room with the instinct of a survivor, declared that the treaty obligated Romania only if Germany were attacked, not if Germany were the aggressor. More fundamentally, Brătianu understood what the old king could not, that Romanian public opinion overwhelmingly opposed fighting alongside Austria, Hungary, the empire that ruled over nearly 3 million ethnic Romanians in Transylvania. The council voted for neutrality. Carol withdrew to his private chambers, broken. He died 3 months later, having witnessed the collapse of his life's diplomatic architecture. His nephew, Ferdinand, inherited not a throne but a dilemma. Romania possessed something every belligerent desperately wanted: oil. The Ploiești fields produced nearly 1,900,000 tons annually, 17% of global output. It also controlled wheat that could feed armies, a strategic position astride the Danube, and an army of 600,000 men that could tip the balance on the Eastern Front. From the moment Ferdinand took his oath, he became the target of the most intensive diplomatic pressure campaign of the war. The Entente sent their finest seducers. France dispatched the poet-politician Maurice Palaeologue, who painted vivid pictures of a greater Romania stretching from the Tisza to the Dniester, uniting all Romanian speakers under one crown. Britain sent Sir George Berkeley, who spoke in the cool language of British pounds and post-war commercial treaties. Russia, despite ruling over millions of Romanians in Bessarabia whom they had no intention of surrendering, nonetheless promised everything except Bessarabia. The Central Powers, meanwhile, employed both threats and promises, suggesting that Romanian neutrality was valued, but reminding Bucharest, with ominous subtlety, of what German divisions had done to Serbia. In Athens, a similar drama unfolded, though with a constitutional twist that would tear the nation in two. Greece had emerged from the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 as the regional victor, having seized Macedonia, Crete, and the Aegean Islands, nearly doubling its territory. King Constantine I, brother-in-law to Kaiser Wilhelm and commander who had led Greek forces to those victories, believed Greece's future required neutrality and eventual alignment with whichever side proved stronger. His prime minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, Greece's greatest modern statesman, believed exactly the opposite, that Greece must join the Entente immediately, that the war represented a historic opportunity to seize Constantinople and fulfill the Megali idea, the dream of Greek dominion over all historically Greek territories. The clash between Constantine and Venizelos was not merely personal, but represented a fundamental split in how nations conceived their interests. Constantine thought in terms of traditional dynastic calculation, military readiness, and prudent risk management. Venizelos thought in terms of historical destiny, democratic legitimacy, and the reward that courage might bring. Both men were intelligent, both were patriots, and both would be proven partially right and catastrophically wrong. Throughout 1915, as the Western Front congealed into static horror and the Eastern Front swayed back and forth across Poland, Romania and Greece maintained their neutrality, watching, calculating, adjusting their demands as the military situation changed. They were not passive. They were conducting what scholars would later call neutrality bargaining, auctioning their support to the highest bidder, exploiting the desperate need of exhausted empires for fresh troops and resources. Romania's price grew steadily. In addition to Transylvania, Brătianu demanded Bucovina and the Banat, territories that would bring the entire Carpathian mountain range under Romanian control. He insisted on weapons, shipments, guaranteed borders, and a voice at the peace conference. The Entente, bleeding out at Gallipoli and Champagne, agreed to nearly everything. The Treaty of Bucharest, signed in August 1916, promised Romania territorial gains so extensive that the country would increase in size by nearly 90%. It seemed like the diplomatic triumph of the century. Greece's bargaining took a stranger form. In March 1915, the Entente offered Greece, Serbia, and Macedonia, and significant portions of Asia Minor in exchange for joining the Gallipoli campaign. Venizelos accepted enthusiastically. Constantine refused to honor the commitment, dismissed Venizelos, and called new elections. Venizelos won those elections, returned to power, and invited Entente forces to land at Salonika in October 1915 to support Serbia. Constantine again intervened, dismissing Venizelos a second time, creating a constitutional crisis that would fracture Greek society along a fault line still visible today. What neither Romania nor Greece fully grasped, in their careful calculations and their bargaining for maximum territorial gain, was that they were negotiating under assumptions that no longer held. They behaved as if they were independent actors in a functioning state system, as if international law and treaty obligations retained meaning, as if great powers would honor commitments to small states once those small states were no longer useful. They were operating with the diplomatic grammar of the 19th century in a conflict that was systematically destroying that grammar. The First World War was not a traditional cabinet war. It was an industrial mobilization that subordinated everything, including international norms, to the singular goal of victory. In such a war, neutral states were not protected by their neutrality. They were merely targets that had not yet been prioritized. Act 2. The collapse of calculation. Romania's entry into the war on August 27, 1916, was greeted with euphoria in Bucharest and Paris, relief in London and Rome, and grim satisfaction in Berlin. The Central Powers had been preparing for this moment for months. General Erich von Falkenhayn, recently dismissed as chief of the German General Staff after Verdun, was given command of the 9th Army with a specific mission: crush Romania before winter. He was joined by Field Marshal August von Mackensen, the conqueror of Serbia, commanding a mixed force of German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Turkish troops. The Romanian offensive into Transylvania began promisingly. Within 2 weeks, Romanian forces had advanced nearly 80 kilometers, occupying Brașov and Sibiu, meeting limited resistance from Austro-Hungarian units weakened by years of war. In Bucharest, newspapers printed victory editions. The French military mission assured Brătianu that German forces were too committed at Verdun and the Somme to mount a serious counter-offensive. Russian promises of a supporting offensive in the east seemed to guarantee that Romania would not face the Central Powers alone. Every assumption proved false within a month. Falkenhayn's counter-offensive began on September 18th, with an artillery bombardment of Romanian positions in the Carpathian passes that matched anything on the Western Front for intensity. German and Austro-Hungarian mountain troops, many veterans of the Alpine Front against Italy, infiltrated Romanian lines through paths Romanian commanders did not know existed. By September 26th, Romanian forces were in full retreat from Transylvania, abandoning in days what they had taken in weeks, leaving behind thousands of prisoners and most of their heavy equipment. Simultaneously, Mackensen struck from the south. His army crossed the Danube near Sistova on November 23rd, employing pontoon bridges constructed with German engineering precision, supported by artillery barrages that Romanian defenders, equipped largely with obsolete French rifles, could not answer. The Romanian Third Army, tasked with defending the Danube line, disintegrated. Mackensen's cavalry exploited the breach, ranging across the Wallachian plain, cutting rail lines and surrounding retreating units. The promised Russian offensive never materialized in strength. General Alexei Brusilov, exhausted from his summer offensive that had shattered Austria-Hungary but cost Russia 1 million casualties, could spare only limited forces for Romania. Those that arrived were poorly supplied, badly coordinated with Romanian units, and increasingly demoralized by rumors from home of bread riots and revolutionary agitation. By early December, Bucharest was indefensible. The government fled to Iași in Moldova, carrying what archives could be moved, abandoning the capital to its fate. On December 6, 1916, German and Austro-Hungarian troops entered Bucharest without firing a shot. The city's population, which had celebrated entry into the war just over 3 months earlier, watched in silence as foreign soldiers occupied the Parliament building and raised the German war flag over the royal palace. The speed and completeness of Romania's defeat shocked every remaining neutral. In a matter of 14 weeks, Romania had gone from optimistic aggressor to occupied territory, its army reduced from 600,000 to fewer than 200,000 effective troops, its richest provinces under enemy control, its oil flowing to Berlin rather than Paris. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Germany gained direct access to Romanian wheat, sufficient to feed its army through the 1917 harvest. The Ploiești oilfields, though damaged by retreating Romanian engineers, were repaired by German technicians and soon producing 4,000 barrels daily for the Central Powers. Most critically, the collapse of Romania released over 400,000 German, Austro-Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops for redeployment to other fronts. But the psychological impact exceeded even these material gains. Romania's catastrophe demonstrated that the Entente's promises, no matter how generous on paper, meant nothing without the military capacity to fulfill them. No treaty could protect a small nation if the great powers lacked the will or strength to honor their commitments. This lesson was absorbed with particular intensity in Athens. Greece's crisis had been building throughout 1916. The Entente occupation of Salonika, initially presented as support for Serbia, had evolved into a permanent military presence that violated Greek sovereignty. Constantine's government protested but lacked the power to expel French and British troops. Venizelos, meanwhile, had established what amounted to a rival government in Salonika, a provisional administration that controlled northern Greece with Entente backing and claimed to represent the true will of the Greek people. The schism, as Greeks called it, split families, the military, and civil society. In Athens, royalist mobs attacked Venizelists, burning their homes and businesses. In Salonika, Venizelist authorities arrested royalist officers and officials. The king controlled the capital and constitutional legitimacy. Venizelos controlled Greece's second city and the backing of the world's two greatest naval powers. Neither could compromise without losing everything. The Entente applied steadily escalating pressure. In December 1916, French and British troops landed in Piraeus, ostensibly to protect their diplomatic personnel but actually to intimidate Constantine. Street fighting erupted between Entente troops and Greek royalist units, leaving dozens dead. The incident, known in Greece as the Noemvriana, the November events, hardened royalist resistance and convinced Constantine that the Entente would stop at nothing to remove him. Throughout the first half of 1917, as revolution consumed Russia and mutinies swept the French army, the Entente maintained an increasingly strict blockade of royalist Greece. French warships prevented food imports into Athens and southern Greece. The population faced genuine hunger. British diplomats made clear that the blockade would continue until Constantine abdicated. The French government, led by the fiercely anti-monarchist Georges Clemenceau, demanded regime change as the price of Greek sovereignty. The mechanism of Constantine's removal demonstrated how completely the old diplomatic order had collapsed. On June 11, 1917, French High Commissioner Charles Jonat delivered an ultimatum. Constantine must abdicate within 24 hours or French troops would march on Athens. There was no legal basis for this demand, no precedent in modern European diplomacy for such naked coercion of a neutral nation's sovereign. Yet Constantine had no choice. His army was blockaded, his people starving, his son held hostage by the Entente's control of northern Greece. On June 12, he abdicated in favor of his second son, Alexander, bypassing his eldest son precisely because the Entente demanded it. Venizelos returned to Athens in triumph on June 26, resuming the premiership and immediately declaring war on the Central Powers. Greek troops joined the Salonika front, fighting under Entente command against Bulgaria. Greece had entered the war not through calculation or treaty obligation or even popular demand, but through starvation and military occupation, compelled by powers that claimed to fight for small nations' rights while systematically crushing Greek sovereignty. The parallels between Romania and Greece were not exact, but the lesson was identical. Neutral nations had discovered that their neutrality was worthless, that promises from great powers meant nothing, that the war had created a new logic in which sovereignty belonged only to those strong enough to defend it. Romania had chosen to join the war and been destroyed. Greece had tried to remain neutral and been forced in by blockade. The result was the same: the death of the diplomatic system that had, however imperfectly, preserved space for smaller nations to maneuver. Act 3. The Reckoning. The winter of 1916 to 1917 marked the nadir of Entente fortunes. Romania had collapsed. Russia teetered toward revolution. The Somme offensive had gained a few miles at the cost of over 600,000 British and French casualties. Unrestricted submarine warfare would soon bring America into the war, but American troops would not arrive in strength for over a year. In London and Paris, strategists confronted the possibility of defeat. For Romania and Greece, trapped in a war neither had wanted in the form they received it, the winter brought suffering on a scale their societies had never experienced. The Romanian army, compressed into Moldova, faced typhus epidemics that killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Supply lines through Russia, the only route not controlled by the Central Powers, broke down as the Russian Empire dissolved into chaos. French and British military missions in Iași watched helplessly as their newest ally disintegrated. Yet Romania did not surrender. Despite occupation of most of its territory, despite disease and starvation, despite the manifest failure of every promise made by the Entente, the government in Iași maintained a front. Romanian troops, reorganized and retrained by French officers, held the line through the winter, clinging to Moldova through sheer stubbornness. When German and Austro-Hungarian forces attacked in the summer of 1917, expecting to finish what they had started, they encountered an army that had learned from its catastrophic defeats. At Ploiești, in August 1917, Romanian forces held against repeated German assaults, inflicting over 50,000 casualties and forcing the Central Powers to abandon their offensive. This was not victory in any conventional sense. Romania remained mostly occupied, its economy destroyed, its population reduced by disease and malnutrition. But the stand at Ploiești demonstrated something the diplomatic calculations of 1916 had not anticipated, that a nation could survive the death of its illusions, that defeat could be absorbed and transformed into a different kind of resistance. Greece's war was stranger still. Greek troops fought on the Salonika front not to defend Greek territory, but to attack Bulgarian positions in Macedonia and Serbia, executing Entente strategy under French command. The Greek army, once considered among the Balkans' best after its victories in 1912 and 1913, found itself subordinated to foreign officers, its movements dictated by priorities set in Paris and London. Yet Greek soldiers fought with surprising effectiveness, perhaps because Venizelos had successfully convinced many that they were fighting not for the Entente but for the megali idea, for a Greece that would emerge from the war stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, from Epirus to Anatolia. The great irony was that both nations, having lost their diplomatic independence, having been forced or seduced into a war that destroyed their calculations, would emerge from the peace conference with many of the territorial gains they had been promised. Romania, despite its occupation and near collapse, received Transylvania, Bukovina, Bessarabia, and part of the Banat, becoming Greater Romania with a population of nearly 18 million, more than double its pre-war size. Greece received Thrace and a mandate to occupy Smyrna, bringing it closer to the megali idea than at any point in modern history. But these gains came with a price their leaders had not calculated. Romania received territories with large Hungarian, German, and Ukrainian minorities, creating ethnic tensions that would destabilize the interwar state. Greece received Smyrna only to lose it 3 years later in a catastrophic war with Turkey that ended in genocide and the permanent exchange of populations, the death of the megali idea, and the creation of a refugee crisis that would scar Greek society for generations. The diplomatic pressure that forced Romania and Greece into the First World War did not end when the guns fell silent. It had taught both nations, and every smaller state watching, that the international system offered no protection, that treaties were conditional, that the great powers would promise anything and honor only what suited their interests. This lesson would shape the diplomacy of the interwar period. creating a climate of cynicism and opportunism that made the slide toward the Second World War harder to resist. Epilogue: The weight of choices. In 1956, the historian and former Romanian diplomat Nicolae Titulescu, reflecting on his country's entry into the First World War, wrote a passage that captured something essential about the neutral nation's dilemma. He described sitting in a Bucharest cafe in August 1916, a young diplomat watching the celebrations as Romania declared war. Around him, people sang patriotic songs, convinced that Transylvania would be theirs within weeks, that the Entente's victory was assured, that Romania's timing had been perfect. Titulescu remembered thinking, even then, that something was wrong, that the very ease with which the Entente had agreed to Romania's demands suggested they were desperate rather than generous, that desperate powers made dangerous allies. He did not speak his doubts aloud. No one would have listened. The momentum toward war was irresistible, built on 2 years of diplomatic pressure, territorial promises, and the seductive logic that neutrality could not last forever, so one must choose the winning side. 40 years later, Titulescu understood that his younger self had glimpsed the truth but not its full implications. Romania had not chosen wrong between the Entente and the Central Powers. There had been no right choice. The war had created conditions in which every choice led to catastrophe, where neutrality invited invasion and participation invited destruction, where the very act of calculation was a trap because the calculations assumed a world that no longer existed. Greece's reckoning came faster. By 1923, the Megali idea lay in ruins. Over 1 million Greek refugees from Asia Minor were flooding into a country that could not feed them, and the political divisions created by the schism had produced a cycle of coups and counter-coups that would plague Greek democracy until the 1970s. Venizelos, the architect of Greece's entry into the war, lived long enough to see his grand vision collapse into ashes. In his final years, he wrote privately that he had been wrong not about the opportunity but about the price, that he had understood what Greece could gain but not what it would lose in the gaining, that the war had taught him, too late, that great historical moments often feel liberating when they are actually trapdoors. The pressure placed on Romania and Greece during the First World War represented more than diplomatic coercion. It represented the transformation of international relations from a system based, however imperfectly, on law and reciprocal obligation into something rawer. A Darwinian struggle in which power was the only currency and sovereignty belonged exclusively to the victorious. Smaller nations could still exist, but only as clients of greater powers, their independence formal but their choices constrained by the weight of threats they could not resist and promises they could not verify. This was the true neutrality dilemma, not whether to join the war, but how to preserve any meaningful independence in a world that no longer recognized neutrality as a legitimate status. Every neutral nation discovered, sooner or later, that it would be forced to choose, that the choice would be presented as voluntary but enforced by blockade or invasion, and that no choice, once made, could be unmade. When scholars assess the First World War's impact, they typically focus on the collapse of empires, the death of monarchies, the birth of new nations. But for countries like Romania and Greece, the war's legacy was more subtle and perhaps more corrosive. The death of diplomatic possibility, the lesson that international law was a fiction maintained only while convenient for the powerful, that survival required not principle but flexibility, not calculation but luck. In the years after 1918, as Europe stumbled toward another catastrophe, this lesson shaped how smaller nations responded to rising threats. When Hitler began dismantling Versailles, countries like Romania remembered how the Entente's promises in 1916 had led to disaster, how entering the war had brought occupation rather than expansion. When Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union carved up Eastern Europe in 1939, Romania and Greece both understood, with the bitter wisdom of experience, that they were not actors but objects, that the great powers would decide their fates regardless of what their leaders calculated or negotiated or chose. The telegraph operator who decoded Berlin's message on that September morning in 1916 could not have known any of this. He knew only that Romania's gamble had failed, that the promises had been empty, that the calculation had been wrong. As he walked through those silent corridors to wake the minister, he carried not just a message but the beginning of understanding, the first recognition that his country's fate had never been in its own hands, that the diplomatic pressure Romania had tried to leverage for maximum gain was not pressure between equals but the closing of a trap. This is what the neutral nations learned in the Great War, that neutrality was not a choice but a condition, temporary and fragile, that would end when greater powers decided to end it. That treaties protected only those who could enforce them. That promises meant nothing without power to compel their fulfillment. That the old world of diplomatic calculation, of careful bargaining and treaty law, had died in the trenches of Verdun and the wheat fields of Wallachia, replaced by something crueler and more honest. The recognition that in total war there were no neutral nations, only occupied territories and future battlefields. The pressure on Romania and Greece was not an aberration or a temporary expedient of desperate powers. It was a revelation of what modern war actually meant, of how industrial mobilization dissolved the boundaries between combatant and neutral, between sovereign nation and strategic asset, between ally and victim. Both countries survived the war and gained territory, but they lost something harder to measure. The illusion that small nations could navigate between great powers through cleverness and timing, that there existed some perfect calculation that would bring reward without risk, expansion without destruction. That illusion died in the winter of 1916, in the ruins of Bucharest and the streets of a divided Athens, in the knowledge that every choice had been wrong because the choice itself had been a lie. The neutral nations had never been neutral. They had only been nations whose turn had not yet come, pieces on a board they did not control, moving according to a logic they could not decipher until it was too late to matter. And when their turns came, when the pressure that had been building found its release, they discovered what so many nations would discover in the century to come: that sovereignty without power is merely a word, that independence exists only at the sufferance of the strong, and that the greatest illusion of all is believing that calculation can save you from history when history has decided your fate.